My great delight is to introduce to you Professor Jennifer Robertson. Professor Robertson is Professor Emerita of the Departments of Anthropology and the History of Art, and an affiliate professor at the Robotics Institute at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She's also an affiliate professor in the Departments of Anthropology and Japan Studies at the University of Washington, Seattle. This is sort of a homecoming for Professor Robertson.
Very nostalgic.
She did her BA in the History of Art here at Cornell, then moved to the University of Hawaii, Manoa to complete her MA in Asian Studies, and then returned to Cornell to earn her PhD in Anthropology in 1985. And since then, she has established herself internationally as one of the leading scholars of Japan and in diverse fields from anthropology to art and science and technology studies. She's won many fellowships and awards. For example, she was an invited fellow at the Wissenschaftliche Kollektiv zu Berlin, a fellow of the Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, a Fulbright fellow, and I could go on in this list. She's won just about every fellowship there is to win. As a historical anthropologist, her 7 books and over 90 articles and book chapters address a wide spectrum of topics dating from the 17th century up to the present and even the future. So her subjects of study, of research, have included sex and gender, popular culture, urbanism, theater, performance, and the arts, imperialism and colonialism, eugenics and bioethics, and of course technology and robotics. So without further ado, I want to introduce Professor Robertson and her talk, Robo-sexism, Gendering AI and Robots in Japan and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your generous introduction. Yeah, it's really a nostalgic pleasure to be here. I was sort of walking around looking at my old homes in College Town, which hasn't changed at all. I have to say the campus has. But thank you, Kristen Roebuck, for nominating me to give the university lecture, which is a great and heartfelt honor. And especially, as you already know, Cornell is both my undergraduate and graduate alma mater. I'd also like to thank Amala Lane for her help in handling the Zoom and recording for today's event. And I owe a big thanks as well to my talented former professors and mentors, not all of whom are on the planet, and their inspiring research. And of course, thank you to all the sponsoring departments and programs. And a special thank you to my good friend and graduate school cohort mate, Dr. Yoko Tsuji, for her generous hospitality. So I've been researching Japanese service and personal robots for over 20 years. And you're probably wondering why the robots on the cover of my book are in a cage. Well, they are headed to an industrial waste recycling center. So, most robots have very short lives, unlike their science fiction counterparts. Well, the changes and appearances in the capabilities of these robots over the past 20 years are truly amazing. And that said, compared to what robots in science fiction can do, real-world robots, however awesome looking, as you see here, are much clumsier and slower and limited in capabilities. But that's another story. Many people tend to conflate tangible robots with the ones in science fiction that you see here. From 1927 to 2015, Robot Maria, C3PO, Dot Matrix, Andrew, and Ava. But my focus is on actual tangible robots, although I do show some cartoony illustrations of how real-world robots and artificial intelligence are imagined and imagineered. So let me introduce this group of humanoid robots, half of which have been discontinued. All but Cinnamon was designed with an explicit gender in mind, as we'll see. You have Ashimo, Honda's Ashimo, you have SoftBank's Pepper, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries Wakamaru, Alsoc's Reborg X, Donut Robotics Cinnamon, Hitachi's MEU, and AIST, the National Institute of Advanced Industrial Science and Technology, the Japanese MIT, their robot HRP-4C. And with the exception of HRP-4C, who's a little bit shorter than I am, the tallest average about 4 feet, they're child size, making them much less intimidating. They're also largely white in color, connoting safety, hygiene, innocence, and benignness. All of these robots are equipped with Wi-Fi, with 3D cameras, microphones, speakers, gyroscopes, bumper or foot sensors, and they have, except Cinnamon, arms and hands with touch sensors. Most have lithium batteries that have a 20-minute to 14-hour charge depending on the activity. Some have touch screens as well, like Pepper, for example. Now, many humanoids, like Ashimo, are not end products in themselves. This is really important. They're not end products in themselves. Rather, they are research platforms. The high-tech innovations that went into their development are spun off into lucrative new industries. Humanoids are very challenging to build, and innovations in haptics, optics, balance, and locomotion that go into their production are applied in other projects. And you see here Ashimo has been spun off into various mobility devices. You have a upper body lumbar support exoskeleton, a lower body support exoskeleton, and kind of a robotic unicycle device. Now, although I'm focusing in this talk on humanoids and androids, and the image that most people have of robots is the humanoid, I want to point out that robots exist in many forms and body types, and they're made from many different types of materials: aluminum, stainless steel, thermoplastic polymers, polycarbonates, acrylics, silicon, and even biological cells. The vast majority of robots are industrial robots, upper left, installed in automobile and other factories. Other robots have been designed as animals, fish, rice cookers, bathtubs, wheelchairs, pills, vacuum cleaners, and commodes. Now, humanoid robots have a body that resembles a human being in the sense of having something like a head, arm, torso, and arms, torso, and legs. And most humanoids are gendered. Some, called androids, have silicon faces and hands that can pass from a distance as flesh and blood human beings. They are immobile, apart from making teleoperated facial expressions and vocalizations. And in robotics, teleoperation or telepresencing refers to technology that enables a robot to move. In the case of these androids, they move their heads and speak through the mediation of a remote person. And I'll have more on this a little bit later. Now, as I've said, tangible robots are amazing machines, but far less capable of the feats associated with robots in science fiction. And important to note is that many of the gee whiz videos of real-world robots aired on TV and on YouTube are heavily edited to show seamless action, and they're speeded up, sometimes 30 times. Because, for instance, bipedal robots are really very slow and not entirely stable. Lots of glitches when they move. Now, gender sometimes is only obvious by the name of the robot and the suffix used with the name. As you see here, Yasumaru-kun. Kun is a masculine suffix in Japanese. This is a reception desk robot. Papero is gender neutral, the childcare robot Papero, but color choices may influence consumers as the basis for a unique and even gendered name. This robot was developed for latchkey kids. It connects to the absent parents via a cell phone, so it's basically a mobile surveillance device, but it can also play various vocalized games with children. Now, you may be wondering what the word robo-sexism means in my title, so let me offer a brief definition. I coined the term robo-sexism in reference to the practice among roboticists of designing humanoid robots on the basis of essentialized and reductive stereotypes about human females and males. Now, they may do this intentionally or unintentionally, from indifference or ignorance, for example. And additionally, robo-sexism refers to the roles and applications for humanoid robots imagined or prescribed by engineers and programmers. Now, obviously, the humanoid robots themselves are not sexist. Rather, as forms of embodied intelligence, their design and application reproduce the prejudices of their creators and programmers, and what they essentially take for granted in their own everyday lives. And I'll be giving some examples of this point. Now, in addition to the gendering of robots and AI, I've been interested in looking critically at two aspects of the robotics industry in Japan. One is the type of social setting in which robots and humans are imagined to coexist. The other is the kind of robots with which humans are imagined to coexist. And this SoftBank advertisement of the fictional Asahi family and their robot Pepper nicely summarizes both aspects. It's a 3-generation family and its domestic robot. Now, we all know that the number of 2-generation families in Japan are declining, and 3-generation households are increasingly rare. And I'll be explaining in a minute how the Japanese state, that is the government and corporate sectors, how the Japanese state imagines that robots will rehabilitate the multi-generational family and attendant family-based sex and gender roles. And incidentally, Pepper was introduced in 2014 as a masculine-gendered robot. It was marketed as a companion, and the somewhat techie consumers who purchased Pepper at the underpriced amount of $2,000 are unusual because most of these robots are used as greeters at SoftBank stores and other public venues. And their interactions with humans are very highly supervised. These robots are really quite fragile. Now, related to but separate from robo-sexism is the application of robotic technology for what might be called ethno-nationalistic purposes. That is, to create a robotic labor force to eliminate the need for migrant or immigrant labor and to ensure cultural and ethnic homogeneity. Automation over replacement migration was enshrined in post-World War II domestic policy in Japan. This policy has been recently softened due to dire labor shortages. And robotic technology has yet to achieve the level of sophistication necessary to undertake construction work or, for example, the cleanup of the damaged Fukushima Daiichi nuclear reactors. Instead, today, special visa programs have been created to recruit foreign guest workers, and many others have been employed under the radar, so to speak. This is NextAge, Kawara Robotics, a humanoid robot designed to work alongside humans, which is actually quite dangerous. It has very limited applications. Now, technology and robotics are infused with values that transcend their usefulness and convenience. They offer certain freedoms, but can also be experienced as oppressive and dangerous. They're not neutral fields. Robots are very expensive devices. And as is the case with all of the robots you see here, state and corporate funding in the millions of yen is crucial for robotics research and development. Thus, although many of these Japanese robots are cute, kawaii, they embody government, military, and corporate ideologies and priorities. In the US, for example, robotics is heavily supported by the Department of Defense. And today in Japan, robotics is increasingly incorporated into uncute industries. The hardware and software that go into the production of cute gendered robots are used in the manufacture of surveillance devices, space exploration and moon base preparations, and military equipment, including weapons, although this latter application is not addressed much, if at all, in the Japanese mainstream media. And you see here the various applications of robotics illustrated on the Defense Ministry's website, from exoskeletons to robotic tractors, basically. You have robotic tanks, and you have drones. Now, before we look at more robots, let me pause here for a station break. And I've been leaving the term robot self-evident, so it's time to provide you with a working definition. And I'll start by looking at the origin of the word robot. The English word derives from the Czech word robota, or laborer assigned to drudge work. Coined by litterateur Karel Čapek, on the right, and his artist brother Joseph, the word first appeared in the former's play R.U.R., or Rossum's Universal Robots, published in 1920. The play debuted in Prague in 1921. It's a science fiction melodrama with comical passages. It's about a factory in the year 2000 where artificial humans are mass-produced from protoplasmic matter as tireless workers for export all over the world. Two distinct kinds of robot bodies are assembled at Rossum's, feminine and masculine, and they can pass as flesh and blood humans. They are not metallic. The director of the factory explains why feminine models are needed by noting that the company is simply responding to customer demand for robots that conform to gendered occupations. Feminine robots, he explains, are needed as waitresses, shop girls, and secretaries. So Chapek's robots, the very first artificial human labeled robot, thus reinforce the self-evident binary construction of the sexual and gender division of labor in human society: female/feminine work and male/masculine work. Well, to make a long story short, new model RUR robots are provided with emotions, and they begin to experience anger at their exploitation by humans, so they revolt en masse, killing all but one human. RUR was performed in Tokyo in 1924, as you see here, the scene of the robot revolt, and sparked a fascination in Japan with robots, robotto. And if you're interested in robot theater, little PR, I have an article in the fall 2021 issue of Macadamia on robot theater. Well, let me note in passing that although there are evil robots in Japanese science fiction, the general perception of robots, robotto, in Japan since the 1920s is that they are human-friendly and can even become family members, as you saw in the SoftBank ad of the Asahi family. And I should also note in passing that the concept of artificial human, or jinzo ningen, long predates the word robotto in Japan. Today, robots are symbols of advanced technology and serve as brand ambassadors of transnational companies like Honda, Mitsubishi, Hitachi, and SoftBank. The desirability of human-robot coexistence and collaboration is a major plank in the government's domestic policy platform, a platform spearheaded by former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo, who retired in September 2020, but whose policy agendas remain in place. I'll have more on Abe's robot initiatives in a minute, but let me give you a brief definition at this point of real-world robots. And this is one that I composed from multiple robotic sources. It's comprehensive yet concise. A robot is an assemblage of different technologies: sensors, optics, software, including some level of AI, telecommunication tools, actuators, batteries, polymers, and even biological cells. All of these make it capable of navigating and interacting with its environment with some human programming and supervision, by remote control, or through teleoperation. Some robots are usefully perceived of as embodied AI in the sense that they're equipped with software algorithms that facilitate their ability to interact with their surroundings, to recognize patterns, and to complete given tasks. Now, not all of the robots I've shown you thus far are robotic in the same way, but all of them have some combination of these features. Okay. Now, I have one more bit of context or backstory to share before I refocus exclusively on gendering AI and robotics. Former Prime Minister Abe is behind the state's project to robotize Japan. And in 2007, during his first short stint as Prime Minister, Abe introduced Innovation 25, a retro-visionary blueprint for turning Japan into a nostalgia-tinged robotopia by, among other things, restoring the traditional multi-generational household. All of this is going to happen by 2025, which is now a mere 3 years away, so not likely. So in his plan, the 25 has been dropped, and the plan is now referred to as either Innovation Japan, minus the 25, or Robot Revolution, or Society 5.0, the smart, robotized society. And you see here, this is all on the Cabinet website, still accessible, an example of the multi-generational family in Society 5.0, which offers comfort, vitality, and a high quality of life. And the upper right is especially relevant to this talk. Here's a housewife still in the kitchen and her robot maid helping her make daily life easier and more enjoyable. And so you have all these kinds of cartoon images of the future of Japan on the government's website. What demographic trends informed the original Innovation 25? Well, the current population is about 125.8 million. It's falling rapidly. About 29% of Japanese are over 65, and in some rural areas that climbs up to about 90%. There are 1.3, i.e. one child per married woman, and women and men too are eschewing marriage. Marriage remains in Japan the only sanctioned context for childbirth and childbearing. And maybe in the Q&A I can address that. But consequently, there's an aging and shrinking labor force. And as I mentioned, immigrant labor is not viewed as a desirable solution, although this position is gradually changing. Demographers can no longer take for granted that marriage produces children, so they're radically revising their projected population figures. Now, as illustrated in Innovation 25, robot babysitters, housekeepers, and caregivers will relieve women, this is what Abe believes, will relieve women from household chores and responsibility, making them, apparently, more willing to get married and to have more than 1.3 children. This cartoon of a married woman, mother, working at home, is part of the fictional ethnography included in Innovation 25 of the family of the future. And I discuss this family at length in my book. And incidentally, this fictional ethnography was later published as a book, which is available on Amazon if you're interested. Now, as you can see here, robot maids may do the housework and coordinate family schedules, but married women are still wedded to the home. Instead of going to the office like their husbands, where they can socialize with their human colleagues, the future married women of Japan will telework from home. This future scenario reflects former Prime Minister Abe's womanomics policies, designed to encourage and enable women to work and have a family at the same time. His strategy is based in part on telecommuting by married women, but this actually further embeds women in familial networks based on the traditional division of sex and gender roles. It reinforces the barriers that impede women's access to leadership positions in both governmental and corporate institutions. And some of you may know that Japan ranks 120th of 156 countries in surveys of sex-gender parity in the workforce. Iceland is number one with the most equality. So in short, the state's imagination of a roboticized society reinforces the sexual and gender division of labor and space. And also worth noting is that nowhere in Innovation 25 is the possibility of foreign caregivers entertained. Now, while interviewing roboticists, I quickly realized that they reproduce in their creations much of what they take for granted in their own gendered upbringing. The vast majority, 90+%, of roboticists in Japan are men. The women employed in robotics labs tend to be secretaries or child development psychologists who help design behavioral algorithms. The majority of robot engineers I know and interviewed are married men. And like their mothers, their wives work at home, their fathers and they themselves work outside the home. Most robotics engineers were not tutored in the humanities, much less in gendered studies, and thus don't question the gendered and sexual division of labor in their personal lives, much less in the design and applications of their robots. In short, they reproduce in the lab stereotypes they take for granted in their everyday lives. This is largely true of roboticists in the United States as well, including those writing about the gender dimensions of robotics. Much of this American research has two angles. One asks whether human females and males interact differently with robots. And in this case, human femaleness and maleness are interpreted reductively as binary opposites. The other angle explores whether people interact differently with a feminine or masculine robot. In this case, the binary polarization is shifted to robots, and based on such reductive stereotypes as shoulder width, SW, and waist to height ratios, and lip color. So the hourglass figure that you see here on the right identifies a female robot or a feminine robot, as do the pink lips that you see on the left. I want to quote from one such study in 2005. It's this one over here on the left, which is from a Proceedings of a Humanoid Robotics workshop. And it's a discussion of a hypothesis. Quote, a male or female robot queried users about romantic dating norms. We expected users to assume a female robot knows more about dating norms than a male robot. If so, users should describe dating norms efficiently to a female robot, but elaborate on these norms to a male robot. But I think the circularity of the stereotype is quite clear. So in short, roboticists tend to uncritically reproduce and reinforce dominant stereotypes attached to human female and male bodies and to gender markers. Well, I want to now consider how AI itself is gendered, keeping in mind that robots can be understood as embodied AI. And then I'll move to examples of several actual tangible robots. Well, in 2013, the bi-monthly Journal of the Japanese Society for Artificial Intelligence embarked on a makeover of its humdrum cover, I think you'll agree, and they wanted to attract more subscribers. There was an online competition for cover illustrations of the 2014 issue, and it attracted 100 entries. The editors described the winner as, quote, effectively representing the integration of embodied artificial intelligence into everyday life. And here's the cover of the first issue. The cover features a watercolor of a female robot with a cable connected to her back. She's holding a book in her right hand, a broom in her left. The robo-maid is in a sunny book-lined room that one imagines is usually occupied by a scholar. Something or someone has interrupted her reading. But why is she, a robot maid, perusing a book in the first place instead of sweeping the floor? And I want to give you a little spoiler alert in case you buy my book. She is reading Hegel's Phenomenology of Mind in German. Okay. Okay. Well, criticism of the cover was swift. The editors were swamped with letters rebuking their choice of cover art. Regardless of the anonymous illustrator's actual intentions, the image equates women with housework and implies that book learning distracts working women from household chores. Now, there were many spoofs of the cover published online, including a particularly memorable one of a salaryman robot outfitted in a tie and vest, sleeves rolled up, pushing a broom. And he's powered by a cable connected to his groin, so kind of a touche moment there. Well, days later, the editors published a long apology on behalf of the editorial board on the journal's website. They explained that, quote, because artificial intelligence is something that can't be seen with the eyes, we wanted to have an image that made AI easy to understand. We didn't intend for the cover art to discriminate against women, but the image of a female robot connected to a cable and cleaning gave that impression. Now, you may be wondering what they did with subsequent covers, and they switched to illustrations that featured women using robotic devices instead of embodying AI itself. Okay. So let's take a look at some actual robots. Now, some humanoid robots developed in Japan over the past 2 decades are gendered, if sometimes ambiguously to the untutored eye. Wakamaru, for example, was first marketed by Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in 2005 as a household valet and babysitter. And when I show audiences in the US and in Europe a picture of Wakamaru, many perceive a feminine robot on account of its petticoat-like shape. But Wakamaru was designed as a masculine robot. His 3-foot-tall conical body on wheels combines the shape of yoroi, medieval samurai armor, and that of hakama, the pleated skirt worn over a man's formal kimono. Moreover, Wakamaru's name was inspired by the legendary 12th century samurai Minamoto no Yoshitsune, whose childhood name was Ushi Wakamaru, or young ox. The two sensors, infrared and ultrasonic, on the robot's forehead supposedly resemble Yoshitsune's eyebrows. The designer selected yellow for the robot's body because he declared that color attracts attention, is invigorating, and conveys happiness. Although Wakamaru was engineered as a masculine robot, he was given an opportunity to cross-dress in 2008. And that's when the renowned playwright Hirata Oriza joined with a roboticist in staging a play, Hataraku Watashi, or I Worker, about a robot couple that lives with and cares for a dysfunctional human couple. The Wakamaru robots are distinguished by conventional gender markers, their names, Momoko and Takeo, their clothing, a bow tie and an apron and a basket, and also by their postures and gestures. They have this really neat kind of ball and socket head with an undulating profile. And with strategic stage lighting, this undulating profile provides for many different kinds of expressions. Momoko tends to keep her face down. She's more demure. Her arms stay close to her body. Takeo looks straight out. He assumes assertive postures, and he has a very open body stance. Linguistically as well, Momoko tends to speak a more polite, feminine speech. And I have a clip for you to watch. You should be able to hear that.
みたいなのをどういうふうにされたんだと。子供がかわいそうじゃない。その点はロボットには分かりません。
Okay, you get the idea. This play is thankfully only 20 minutes long, and that's the robot's battery runs out. But the playwright, sorry about that. The playwright, Hirata Oriza, was keen on experimenting with human-robot communications through gestures and interjections, the ne, ano, and so on and so forth. It's much easier than a complete dialogue on the part of the robot. The roboticists who were involved wanted to exploit the theater as a site outside of the laboratory to explore human-robot relations. Now, one of the most technologically advanced humanoid robots that debuted in 2009 is HRP-4C, Humanoid Robotics Project Fourth Cyborg. She is the one-off creation of AIST, as I mentioned, the Japanese MIT. She's a cyborg in the sense that her face and body proportions are based on the average Japanese female. She's 5'2", weighs about 95 pounds, which is about 22 pounds lighter than the average 20-year-old Japanese woman. The technological objective for her design was to develop and reproduce human-like bipedal walking using the motion capture process of recording and programming. So you have here a human model with all these sensors attached that then are fed, digitalized, and then fed into the robot's central processing unit, basically. It's very difficult to engineer a bipedal robot, much less one that walks naturally like a human. So the roboticists focused on three characteristics of human heel-to-toe walking: a single toe support, knee stretching, and swing leg motion. So walking is essentially controlled or prevented falling. Ashimo, in comparison, is flat-footed and walks like this. And because you know, he is not very stable and his knees have to be bent in order to keep him from falling over. HRP4C has a much more natural human-like walk. I want to also note that this kind of sound is read as data by the robot, so it's really important for them to be fitted with noise filtering soles on their robot feet. Because the sounds of locomotion and all ambient noise that we filter out automatically are, again, as I mentioned, read as data by the robots. And so without these filtering algorithms, the robot would develop software glitches and would basically become inoperable. And one of the spin-off industries of robot shoes has been high-tech running shoes for humans, basically. Interesting. Mizuno shoes, if you're interested. Now, HRP4C is nicknamed Mime, M-I-I-M, and I couldn't find an official explanation for her nickname, but I surmise that it may be a reference to meme, M-E-M-E, which is basically in reference to patterns or elements that can be imitated. And also, neuroscientists explain that a meme is a perceived behavioral scheme that can be translated by the brain or the robot CPU into an action scheme, making the imitation of perceived behavior possible. So the nickname meme most likely points to her ability to mimic human female behaviors via motion capture technology. She also has speech recognition software and is equipped with Yamaha's Vocaloid singing voice synthesizer. And I'll show footage of her in a minute. Framed by shoulder-length black hair in a page boy style, her face, made out of silicone, was fashioned from a composite photograph of the 5 female secretaries at the lab where she was created. Like her face, Mime's large hands are also covered in silicone skin, but the rest of her anthropometrically scaled body is made of silver and black plastic. And I never, to this day, got a good answer as to why a robot body needs such realistic anatomical features as a mons pubis, ample breasts, and shapely naturalistic buttocks. And especially if you think, you know, her face is a composite of the 5 faces of the secretaries. Anyway, at public events, Mime most often appears clothed. In fact, she debuted in a wedding dress at a fashion show in March 2009, prompting one of my Japanese friends to wonder if robot models were being employed to promote and glamorize marriage. Her other onstage appearances include cosplaying as a dancer, a French maid, and as the popular anime Vocaloid Hatsune Miku. Now, one of her only real-world functions is as an entertainer. She sings and dances. Oop. Okay, you get the idea. I just want to note how incredibly complex it is to develop technology that enables a bipedal robot to lift and balance on one leg and to move in sync with the music. But these innovations are spun off into other industries, other mobility industries. Well, in comparison, I'd like to introduce to you another feminine robot, this one developed by NASA, the US Space Agency. And here's Valkyrie, a female gendered robot unveiled in 2013. She's part of a Mars colonizing program, which imagines robots preparing living quarters for astronauts. She's 6'2" and 275 pounds, and she appears to have breasts. Now, unlike the Japanese robots we've seen, Valkyrie was not gendered from the start, but became feminized, as a NASA spokesperson explains in somewhat clunky tech talk, and I want to quote it. To keep the center of mass as close to the geometric center of the robot, we had to push the battery as far forward into the torso as we could. The battery weighs more than 30 pounds. If we had not, and instead chosen a backpack, we would have had a very hunched over walking style. And therefore, it would have been very challenging from a manipulation standpoint. In addition, we also needed to have an articulating waist so that the manipulation workspace of the robot could be repositioned while standing and not moving. The linear actuators for the waist then were positioned around the battery and subsequent power converters. Given the kinematics of the waist and therefore subsequent angle of the actuators, it led us to a feminine humanoid feature. Okay. End quote. I was really intrigued. Now, I always have to follow up when they come out with these statements. You need to check the website again because they often change their explanations. And so in 2018, 5 years later, NASA changed the rationale for the robot's feminine gender and insisted instead that they wanted to build a robot from the outset that looked like, quote, a female first responder or female Marine in body armor. And in this connection, it's interesting to note that in Norse mythology, the Valkyries were a group of maidens who rode into battles to choose from among the fallen those whose martial efforts made them worthy of a place in Valhalla, which is one of the Norse equivalents of heaven. I juxtaposed Mime with Valkyrie to scale. Both are in a femme fatale pose. They're positioned forward, arms akimbo, right knee is bent, and shoulders are not squared, suggesting, if not quite a come hither pose, then a somewhat relaxed feminine pose. So again, the emphasis is on femininity. Okay. Now I want to shift to a comparison of human and robot bodies with respect to sex and gender. Now there are at least two kinds of human bodies, the female body and the male body. That said, female and male bodies themselves are distinguished by a very broad spectrum of biological variability from outward or phenotypic appearance, size, shape, color, to biochemical, hormonal, chromosomal constitution, to post-puberty, the usual physical capabilities, menstruation, pregnancy, lactation, ejaculation, and so forth. There are also intersexed infants whose bodies don't conform to this anatomical binary. And if this were a different talk about humans, I'd go into more detail about this. But it's safe and accurate to say that at birth, the majority of human bodies, anatomically speaking, more or less conform outwardly to two basic patterns designated female and male. Gender, however, is not simply a natural feature or a characteristic of a given female body or a given male body. Gender defines historically, culturally, socially, individually determined or defined or performed modes of speech, dress, hairstyle, body language, and adornment. Most humanoid bodies are purposefully designed from the start to fit a particular task. And since these tasks are often gendered, as exemplified by the robots you see here, from the RUR 1920 play and Mime and Elsock, the security guard robot, a given robot's body is gendered from the design stage. They already have the gender in mind when the robot is designed. In humans, however, gender, femaleness, maleness, femininity, masculinity, is ascribed at birth, usually by a doctor, based on sex or visible, unambiguous genitals. And of course, gender is ultimately fluid and contingent upon personal choices and by social and cultural constraints and circumstances. But in robots, gender is a necessary condition of the body. That is, a robot's assigned gender precedes and determines the design and construction of its body. And as I showed in the case of the masculine gendered Wakamoto robot in the play I, Worker, a humanoid's gender can also be reassigned when required. And this too emphasizes and reinforces a strict binary division of femininity and masculinity. Now this is an opportune moment, because I'm always asked this question when I give a talk on robot gender, to discuss very briefly the overhyped, in my view, subject of so-called sex robots, all of which are androids, really. Sex robots is kind of a misnomer because they are basically inert dolls. None have AI. Some of them are capable of minimal movements and vocalizations, little squeaks, even if those. Some robots are fitted with human-like genitalia and are utilized, in Japan at least, by mostly male human partners in a variety of erotic activities. The recent uproar about sex robots, there's a campaign against sex robots that started in 2015, is, in my view at least, and I elaborate on this in my book a little bit, an example of overhype. The concerns raised about intimate human-robot relations, including emotional dependency and the possibility of systematic dehumanization of women and children, are hardly unique to human-robot relations. In fact, they are endemic in many human-human relationships and encounters, from domestic violence, sexual harassment, institutionalized torture, and brutal warfare. Moreover, the campaign against sex robots sanctimoniously lumps diverse human sex work and sex workers together with human trafficking and pedophilia, which is a misleading conflation criticized by activists pursuing human rights for sex workers. In contrast, experienced ethnographers pay attention to the diverse range of relationships transacted among humans, animals, organic, and inorganic things, without assuming a priori their inherent goodness or badness. And so I've defined sex and gender for you, so let me just briefly offer a definition of sexuality in this context. So sexuality is most efficiently described as a domain of desire and erotic pleasure, quite complex and far more varied and inventive than conveyed by the 19th century European terms heterosexual and homosexual. Sexuality is certainly more complex than simply an urge to procreate. And it makes sense instead to talk in the plural about sexualities. Now, with respect to sexualities, another question I often asked, and I gave a lecture on this for a group in London, I'm often asked about the possibility of queer robots. Now, this image is used by a project initiated by the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in Trondheim to explore what a queering of robots might entail. And they said there's a need for queer perspectives. The caption is, "Will robots and AI respond appropriately to an elderly gay couple?" Well, the illustrators, because I contacted them, they told me by email that they had simply been designed to create an illustration of a gay-friendly robot, period. So the rainbow coloring of the robot is meant to represent embodied AI that is queer, or more specifically non-binary. But what has yet to be discussed is how such a robot would actually function. LGBTQ+ perspectives and behaviors are hardly homogeneous or free from political, class, ethnic, and gendered influences themselves. How and what exactly would LGBTQ+ perspectives contribute to robot design or embodiment, or to applications of robotic technology? What would a tangible queer robot, as opposed to a cis robot, look like? So the rainbow coloring, in a way itself, is rather irrelevant in terms of actual function. Now, similar problems arise in artificial intelligence with respect to facial and vocal recognition software based on essentialized reductive models of ethnicity and voice. Obviously, there's no singular definitive way of acting, much less being queer or straight, for that matter. For a humanoid robot capable of some level of gesture and equipped with a vocal synthesizer, to perform as queer or cis would simply represent its programmer's algorithmically reproduced assumptions and even biases, whether or not those programmers themselves identified as LGBTQ+. So the result would be but a stereotype or set of stereotypes, because unlike flesh and blood humans, robots do not have self-determined agency. They are not under any obligation to conform to socio-cultural norms of gendered behaviors, including body language, modes of dress and hairstyle, cosmetic effects, and so forth. Nor, unlike humans, are robots capable of feeling motivated or compelled to rebel against or reject sociocultural norms of gendered comportment. That attempts have been made to develop algorithms to detect sexuality from photographs on dating sites alerts us to the disturbing problem of classifying and reifying entirely relational appearances and practices as fixed categories. So the most basic solution to the queer robot question is to design gender-neutral robots, which is the case for the vast majority of robots used today. The vacuum cleaners, the industrial robots, the wheelchair robots, the commode robots. Several years ago, I had a chance to observe what I call the accidental queering of a humanoid robot, and in this case, an android. Now, as I noted earlier, these lifelike robots are basically teleoperated devices. So here's a picture of a feminine android at a robot exhibit I went to in 2016 at the Miraikan, or the National Museum of Emerging Science and Innovation in Tokyo. The robot is a very elegant woman in a kimono, and her hair is in a traditional chignon. She is called an otonaroido, or adult android, and her role is to converse with visitors, as you see here. Note the arrow, pay attention to that room. Her voice is provided by the wizard behind the curtain, so to speak. And in this case, the wizard is a male technician in that room who scans the gallery through the robot's eyes, generates her facial expressions, and essentially ventriloquizes. That day, the technician in the booth was a non-native speaker of Japanese. Now, what was sex and gender bending in this case was that the traditional kimono-clad feminine robot was provided with a rather brusque, accented, masculine-type language, giving her a decidedly unfeminine voice and affect. I mean, it was. Now, I noticed this sort of disconnect or queering right away, but I didn't get the impression that the other visitors did, most of whom were from foreign countries. This technician made no effort to speak a more polite and thus feminine Japanese, nor did he pitch his voice in a higher feminine register. Now, in contrast, as you know, MEME's HRP4C's voice is produced by a vocal synthesizer that reproduces stereotypical women's speech. And you could gather that from the video I showed of her dancing and singing. And Momoko, too, in the I Worker video. But roboticists as a group are not interested in radical sex and gender politics. It's useful to think of roboticists as imagineers, not just of machine bodies, but of cultural configurations and social arrangements as well. But the act of imagining per se does not necessarily yield fresh or progressive results. And as I've shown, Innovation 25 or Society 5.0 and the Japanese AI and humanoid robotics industries exemplify robo-sexism and what I call retro tech, or advanced technology in the service of the status quo. A vision of and for new technologies that facilitate the transcendence of ethnocentrism, of paternalism, sexism, and their associated power relations is nowhere evident in Innovation 25 and Society 5.0. So in closing, the big question, the big task for us, teachers and students alike, is how can we point technology and robotics in more progressive directions and toward more progressive end products and applications? We've heard and read a lot lately about the toxic masculinist bro culture of Silicon Valley. And there's now ample evidence that AI does not create bias. AI reflects the prejudices and biases of its programmers, as in the case of facial recognition, which recalls 19th century physiognomy. There's nothing artificial about artificial intelligence. It's inspired by people, it's created by people, and most importantly, it has an impact on people. And this is why we need more emphasis in education from K through 12 through graduate school on STEAM, which is STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, plus the arts. Now in Japan, there is a very deep divide between bun, the arts and humanities, and ri, the hard sciences and engineering. And merging them is very, very recently the focus of new educational initiatives. As you can see here at this Education Expo in Tokyo, they actually have an event featuring STEAM ideas. Also, some universities, like the University of Hiroshima, for example, have inaugurated schools of integrated arts and sciences. They call that Sogo Kagakubu. So ultimately, it's the arts and sciences, it's the arts and humanities that will provide the intellectual tools both to question robo-sexism and to imagineer truly progressive technologies with enlightened and humane applications. So we have a lot of work to do. Thank you very much.